Hi, this is Privateer Station, and today we bring you a special interview by Andrei Illarionov, a Russian economist and a former senior policy advisor to Vladimir Putin in the early 2000s, who since 2021 is a senior fellow at the non-government organization Center for Security Policy, based out of Washington, D.C. in the United States. He's talking about his favorite topic, the economy of war, what is done, what is not being done to help Ukraine. His presentation, as always, is very intense and captivating, posing a lot of questions to the listeners. Our special thanks go to our members. This is you who help us continue producing these videos and translating these materials. Today, thanks go to Olga Lewis and Daniel Smith. Thank you, guys. And with this, take a listen. Enjoy. Hello, this is Ukrlife with Illarionov-Nemirya. We're continuing our streams. Sponsor of our today channel is Trademark Hetman. We're glad to have Andrei Illarionov attending our channel today, our stream today. Very glad to have you. Likewise, Ludmila. All right, so let's start. Recently, we have been doing measurements where we are, just taking stock where we are in this war. And I want to continue this conversation. 2 years of big war and 10 years of war of Russia against Ukraine. And many times in conversations with different experts who are conflictologists by their trade, and I heard a lot of statements that if the war doesn't finish in the first year, it lasts 8 to 10 years. Different analogies were being brought, Iran-Iraq war, but regardless. Right now, we have 10 years of war of Russia against Ukraine. What is happening now? Is it 10 years or 2? I think it's an important question to ask. And I would want to pose this question as the main driving question for this conversation and start with what happened during these 2 years of this war. What happened? Russia changed, and death or murder of Alexei Navalny affected things. The West has changed, and I want us to talk about that too. And perhaps let's start with, is it 2 years or 10? And then continue to Russia, and so on about the West. All right, so to start with, 2 or 10? Neither 2 nor 10, 21. Whoa. The length of this conflict, Russian-Ukrainian conflict, Russian-Ukrainian war or Putin's war, Russian aggression against Ukraine, the length of that is 21 years. Why? Because its beginning was rather firmly noted, at least in public space, 17th of September 2003. On that date, Vladimir Putin publicly announced his territorial questions to Ukraine in Kerch Strait and Azov and Black Sea basins. He pronounced this task for himself and posted this task in front of the military political leadership of Russia about acquiring these territories. These documents were public. They were published back then. They are still on the Kremlin site, September 17th, 2003, and it's surprising to me that my Ukrainian colleagues and friends and politicians and diplomats and intel people, whoever, analysts, during all these years have never paid attention when the public part of this conflict, of this aggression, started. What was it? Was it his statement? What was the event? It was a special session of the highest military political leadership of Russia in the city of Yeisk in Krasnodar region. There is an air base there, a branch of academy, of Gagarin Academy in that area. It is the rather remarkable location. It is the second, it's a place of the birthplace of a second aviation detachments in Russia. The first one was near St. Petersburg, the second is in Yeisk. There's a big training school there for over 100 years. It's there. It was created in the Tsar Empire, even before the First World War, a place with big traditions. And Putin selected this place on purpose. So not in Moscow, not in Sochi, but in Yeisk, in that place that, as they call, in the shadow of, in the glory of the battle traditions, the people who attended had a chance to soak it in and to listen to that session. The session itself was closed, but there were a lot of publications on the outcome of it, answers to questions and statements that were made. All that is in open space. It's all published. And before conducting this event on the 17th of September in Yeisk, Putin took a boat trip alongside the Black Sea coast and Caucasus and Azov Sea. During the daytime of that September 17th, he met with then President of Ukraine, Kuchma, on the island of Biruchi, not far from the shore. I think it's Kherson region. There is a natural preserve there. And there was, and probably still is, the country house of the resort of the Communist Party leaders of Soviet Union, and there are facilities for receptions in that place. So that's where the negotiations happened between Kuchma and Putin, and probably they were dedicated to the matters that were published later. Putin, I suspect, was trying to get some feedback from the president of Ukraine. What would happen if Putin will start his aggressive motions? The meeting was not successful and not friendly for both parts. The pictures that remain from this meeting, they tell rather grim faces of both negotiators. And after this meeting, Putin flew to Yeisk to conduct this event, this session. I'll say once again, during this session and after it, publicly, for journalists and for Russian journalists, international journalists, for Ukraine, he made public statements that there is a territorial conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And Leonid Danilovich told me later how this meeting went and what happened after. If you remember, or you can look it up in the historic documents, after a meeting in Yeisk, Putin flew to Belbek, airport Belbek near Sebastopol, and then there was a meeting. There was a rather fashionable project, Euro Economic Forum, actually not Euro, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and I think Belarus. That was announced that it was a new economic space. After that, everybody departed. In a day or two, signed all the economic documents, announced all the toasts, and drank all the whatever needs to be drank at this moment. So after that happened, huge trucks loaded with granite, with stones, started to create a dam to the Ukrainian island of Tuzla in Kerch Strait. And that became known as the Tuzla conflict. With the island of Tuzla and Kerch conflict, you can look it up again. That lasted from about the 20th of September 2023 till the beginning, or actually middle of October of the same year. And during the last days of this issue, the speed of that dam building was rather fast, almost 100 yards per day. And the dam was originating on the Russian shore and was approaching the border, the internationally acknowledged border in the Kerch Strait between two countries. And when it approached the border, President Kuchma himself, he just landed in Brazil to conduct the first in history Ukrainian Latin American visit. A long voyage was planned. If I remember right, I think 5 countries were planned for his visit. The first one to be visited by Ukrainian president was Brazil, and there were others that were planned that were on agenda. And there were several important economic matters that were prepared to be signed. Ukrainian industry was getting ready to supply certain products to Latin America. Latin America was promising to send important supplies to Ukraine that Ukraine was looking to purchase there. This was a very important visit. Nothing happened before that visit, and there was nothing like that in the world history between Ukraine and Latin America, and nothing after. And as Kuchma told me later during this conversation at Beruchi Island with Vladimir Putin, he did mention to Putin that he is going to fly to Latin America, what time frame, what matters is he going to solve, and exactly when the plane of Ukrainian president touched the tarmac in the capital of Brazil, the dam in Tuzla reached the demarcation border between the waters of Ukraine and Russia. At that moment, Kuchma tried to, as he told me, reach by phone President of Russia. The phone was not working. It was not working neither then, nor in an hour, nor in 2 hours. Nobody was picking up the phone. And after the first day in Brazil, I think it was planned for about a week. Of course, a long flight to the other part of the world. Of course, it's implied that it's not a short one-day visit. It's a long trip. But after a day, he had to interrupt his visit, not concluding even his part in Brazil, not visiting for other countries. And since there were no communications with Moscow, he returned back from Brazil to Ukraine. And he flew not into Kiev, but he landed in Crimea. I don't know which specific airport did he land there in, but he went to Kerch right after. From there, he took a boat, reached the Tuzla island. At that time, by his orders, they were already creating some barbed wire lines. They were placing a rather big border guards detachment that hasn't been there before. That was given not only rifles, but also heavier arms. There were some border guard boats present, but the dam was continued to be built and Moscow refused to pick up the phone. That's when Ukrainian president gave an order: if the dam will cross the demarcation line, the naval border between two countries, open fire. This is amazing, by the way, for Kuchma, who was always known for being a politician who could talk to anybody and that he had a rather good channel of communication with Putin. We actually do remember that story about fire, open fire if they cross. Do you think he understood what that meant? Yeah, let me finish that story. So from what I know, and I'll answer that, from what I know and what was told to me, he gave an order. After that order was given, 30 minutes passed, and suddenly a president of Russia called back and asked in a disturbed voice, what is happening there? Do you have any problems? And then Kuchma explained what's happening, and Putin pretended that he doesn't know anything. He pretended that it probably was the governor of Krasnodar district who is doing something on his own, and he will figure that problem, he'll resolve the problem, and everything will be all right. There were several more statements later, and by the way, before this phone call, there were different statements from Russian Duma, from Russian Congress. Such a fellow known later, Rogozin, who was Roscosmos head, was also making a bunch of statements. There were a lot of political statements on both sides. The Ukrainian side was talking, asking questions, what's happening, what Moscow is saying, what is Russia doing. There was no answer. But after this all happened, suddenly all questions disappeared, and that was not mentioned for a while. So, to conclude my long-winded answer to your big question first, what kind of war it is. So for today, this war is almost 21 years old. By September of this year, it will be 21-year anniversary, so to say. There are three significant periods in this war, since 2003 to 2014, since 17th of September 2003 till 19th of February 2014. This is the period that we can call a period of hybrid war. What we have seen in Tuzla, what we saw on the 27th of July 2013 during celebrations of 1025 years of baptizing of Russia in Kiev, where Vladimir Putin flew with leaders of his Orthodox religion in Russia, and Sergei Glaziev, Viktor Medvedchuk, and other important VIP persons were present. They were talking about the unity of Ukrainian and Russian people, and that's when the sanctions were implemented, by the way, against a lot of types of Ukrainian produce and industrial production that were being exported to Russia. That's when they started propagandist campaign and financial campaign against Ukraine. That all started on the 27th of July, 2013. So that's another mile marker in the framework of that hybrid warfare. The 9th of November of the same 2013 was also an important marker when President Yanukovych, then president of Ukraine, was invited to Russia by Putin to, as the participants have described, there were very few participants who flew with him. If you remember, President Yanukovych disappeared from political space and information space for the whole day after landing in Russia. And nobody could understand where he is. There was no communication. There was nothing. He was at one of the military bases, according to the participants in suburbs of Moscow, where Putin basically conducted a seance of psychological terror on him, explaining in words and pictures what will happen with Yanukovych and Ukraine if he will fulfill his promise that he made in Ukraine, that he will sign an economic agreement with Europe about joining a free trade association. We remember all that because these were the events that led to the beginning of Maidan and Revolution of Dignity. These are important mile markers, but it was still the stage of a hybrid warfare. Now, starting with 2014, first with the operation of annexation of Crimea. That was the second stage of this war, that in the language of military experts is often called the war of low intensity warfare, given the number of military assets engaged and the numbers of losses, etc. There were different stages, of course. There were some very hot spots, hot moments there, not only Crimea, Donbass also was set ablaze in April of 2014 when Girkin occupied the town of Slavyansk, and then you know the events that followed. And that went till the 23rd of February of 22. That stage of war could be called as low-intensity warfare. And starting on the 24th of February 22, this is the third stage. And this can be described as a medium-intensity war. That's what's happening now. And when people are saying about the second anniversary, this is only 2 years of the medium-intensity war. We can also subdivide that into two periods. In one of our previous interviews, we talked about that, but we can repeat it again. The first stage was slightly under a year, since the 24th of February of 22 to 14th of January 23. That was the stage of war of medium intensity. And starting the 15th of January 2023 till today, this one is of a higher intensity type, but not really the high intensity yet. Still somewhat in the medium range. Not to tell the whole story, but the main parameters for both subsections of the second stage are as follows. On the first subsection, that lasted about the first year since 2022, February, the quantitative estimations from the aggressor side changed from 200,000 to about 120,000, 150,000 participants. And during the last year, the number, as most resources state, is somewhere near 600 to 650,000 participants in the side of Russian army. So the numbers grew about 3 times since the summer of 22. As for the level of losses, then during the first segment, the first year of this medium intensity warfare, the level of their losses was about 200 men per day. That includes everything: missing in action, killed, wounded. And now these parameters already reaching, on average, and average a month, they're losing about 800 to the last 2 months, 1,000 troops per day. So the intensity has grown 4 to 5 times. Regardless, despite of its growth, according to military science, this war is still considered to be a medium intensity warfare. It is lesser of a fight than the other wars in recent human history: First World War, Second World War, or Russian-Finland War. Those were high-intensity wars, or considered to be, when more people, resources, and more equipment were used, and the daily threshold of losses was much higher. So I apologize for such a long answer, but this is to answer your first question: what are we dealing with? We're dealing with a prolonged war that, for now, we can say it was lasting for over 21 years, or almost 21 years. And every time it increases the level of resources, the level of intensity over time. What our Anglo-Saxon friends are saying, what they're mostly afraid, escalation is happening. That exactly is what's happening. And we can talk later what and why is happening and what should be done to cull it. But everything started with a public announcement of territorial problems that were not even identified or not being reflected upon by the world media. Then there was an attempt to capture Ukrainian island of Tuzla that was not responded to. Then there was a bigger operation to capture Crimea. Since that didn't face any pushback, there was even bigger operation to capture Donbas. Since there was no adequate pushback on this, it started a bigger operation that is now being carried out in Ukraine, an operation to attempt to capture the whole territory of Ukraine and liquidate Ukrainian government and Ukrainian society, Ukrainian nation, and Ukrainian culture. So one of the obvious conclusions that stems out of this observation is that in criminology, it is known as the theory of the broken glass. If the hooligan breaks a glass in a phone booth or in a window and there is no proportional response from police on its liking, then in several stages of escalation, the same bandits would be robbing people, killing them, and raping. And the size of this problem grows disproportionately to the eventuality when police responds to the first incident accordingly and stops the future series of crimes from happening at the very beginning. Same situation unfolded on numerous occasions in world history. We saw that in the 1930s in Europe, when small aggressions that were not addressed properly grew into the World War. Very likewise, events are happening or not happening between Ukraine and Russia. The lack of an answer or absence of it or an inadequate answer lead to escalation. That the scale of war, the scale of problem, and the scale of violence and the numbers of victims and consequences of that violence, not only for Ukraine but for Europe and for the whole world, they are growing. Andrei Nikolaevich, let's then push from what you just outlined And you reminded us a good example from recent history when Russia's actions were not read properly. Do you think current actions of Russia being interpreted well? And before that, I want to ask you, what do you think is happening in Russia during the last 2 years? Do you think it was expected? And we can talk about different things in this regard. So some people are saying that Russia now has been rebuilding its military-industrial complex and is more powerful in this aspect. Other experts are saying that it's on a plateau and a little more time, and if the West awakens, then perhaps the West will win in that struggle. Then the murder of Navalny, how would you explain that? Do you think it falls into some political trend in Russia? And what's happening there? How do you estimate, as a person who, for the most part, is rather well aware of the situation in Russia? I understand you have not been there for a while, but I understand that your focus of research is on Russia. All right, let's separate what already happened and what we have now from what may happen tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, what prognostications are. And second, I think we want to separate different spheres of what was happening in economy, in social, in politics, in military production, in armed forces, etc. Perhaps we won't be able to touch everything, but at least in brief thesis. So first, economically, Russia became stronger, without a doubt. Those conversations that we can hear sometimes from our mostly Western colleagues and partners who are saying that Russia is crippled, they're calculating how much guns and tanks were destroyed, what losses Russia suffered, that they cannot produce certain goods anymore. And we heard that in your streams, in other streams of your colleagues, and in Davos conference, and in Ukrainian panel in Davos, and in the Munich conference, and Ukrainian panel in Munich, and European Union. They all repeat that mantra. The cost of, or the price of that mantra is zero. They're only talking about what they want to believe in. And what they think Ukrainians want to listen. Many Ukrainians indeed like to listen that the enemy is almost gone and our enemies will be dispelled in the light of the sun, as your anthem sings. So life is more complex, and one needs to have enough bravery to look in the face of real threats. Indeed, the first 4 months of this war, till about May, Russian economy received a notable blow. We can discuss how notable it was, but statistically, we saw the diminishing of economic production. We saw jumps and volatility in the ruble exchange rate. We saw the dwindling of currency reserves. We saw a sharp growth in negative reaction towards the war by some part of Russian population. They were noted a bunch of protests, however limited they were, and wherever they were happening, it indeed was occurring. And that was occurring for a maximum span of about 4 months. By May of June of 22, the situation was stabilized, and starting then till today, all the parameters that are used to describe the health of Russian economy, they have been climbing. They are on the rise. Industrial production is growing. GDP is growing. In 2023, again, it's the estimation of Russian stat, but it still is talking about the growth of Russian GDP by 3.6%. Putin really enjoys quoting that number, and he's saying that not a single country of Big Seven has such a growth in 2023, which is unfortunately true. We'll not go deeper into how that percentage was calculated. Shoigu and other political leaders in Russia giving different numbers about the growth of military-industrial complex. Of course, these are to be taken skeptically, and you need to verify. But even if we do not trust these numbers, there are also independent estimations and also numbers provided by the intel services of different countries. Almost every intel service of the Western countries is publishing some data on Russia. They have annual summaries and special publications about events in Russian economy, in military production. They're giving numbers, not what Shoigu stated, but very close to them, and generally comparable. They're saying that indeed the number of shells being produced, artillery shells, has grown. The production of APCs has increased. Tanks production has increased. They are indicating some problems that Russian economy is facing, especially in microchip department and some special materials. But despite of all these issues, they still confirm that what is happening with Russian economy, in English there is a special term that is called resilience. This is the ability to basically hold the blow, ability to recover under the blow. The experts are stating that they're surprised and shocked. They did not expect that, according to them. And it's an important thing to mention that we, even before this last stage of this war, we heard a lot of statements why Russia would want to take on the West. The West is huge. The combined GDP of the West, at least the ones that are united under NATO, is, if I'm not mistaken, $46 trillion. Russian economy is maybe a little over $2 trillion. How can you compare who's going to win? It's obvious. And it's just incomparable, the economic potentials and military production potentials. My colleagues, I think, were making a very big mistake that many of them did. But war is a very harsh teacher who forces you to pay attention to the main parameters. And they're not in the demographic potential. They're not in the general comparison of economic potentials. What is important is the correlation of pure military potentials. How much of military resources or resources that I used to amp up the military is being thrown into the furnace of war by both sides. And here we can see that the volume of resources, however you measure that, either by human lives and the people of the country being thrown into war, but also by expenses that each of the participants spend, exert and dedicate to military production. As we talked before, this is a very important parameter to be able to prognosticate where this all goes. So military potential being used by the aggressor in this war exceeds the economic military potential engaged by Ukraine and provided by partners, allies, and friends of Ukraine to conduct this war. Can we just add for today, right? Yeah, of course, for today. We're talking about the current picture. But it was happening at the 24th of February of 22nd. That was happening in 23rd, and up until now, it's happening the same. In the same fashion, there are no signs that situation will change. Again, it's a very special conversation why, but we can talk about that later. So you also asked what is the situation with Russia. Russia, as the result of what was happening, is increasing its military production, is increasing its military capability, is slowly growing the numbers of their armed forces. Do you remember how in spring of 22, in a lot of streams, even some of your guests here, we're talking about Russia that is running out of steam, that they're gathering the last recruits that they can. They're throwing troops from the Far East, from Karabakh, and they're out of resources. They're out of military detachments. That only tells about professional incompetence of people who are making these statements, in my view. Russian armed forces that were participating in this war, they have grown from about 200,000 in February of 22 to about 650,000 participating in this war now. And the trend for increase still continues. And that is only under a single mobilization since September of 22 and ongoing mobilization that is still happening. And however you call them, the contractors who signed the contracts to fight in this war that is still happening. big question: what will happen in Russia after the 17th of March, after so-called elections of Putin? Will he announce the increase in mobilization, or will he continue to just get by the volunteers who buy into getting money for their fight in this war? It doesn't quite matter. They already have the documents in Russia issued that the numbers of army have to grow by several times to reach to about 2.5 million people. And there are no signs that this order will not be fulfilled. And of course, this is not the full size of army that will be thrown into Ukraine. That can be used as a total number in Ukraine. But given the proportions that we were observing, again, given the training that they're undergoing, to be rough, to provide some rough estimate, we can say at least half of these numbers after some time can be used on the front in Ukraine. So, and I'll say once again, if we are talking about political component of that regime became way more terroristic and harsh compared to what it was before the February of 22. Repressions now are not being used targetedly, they're used blanketly. According to some data coming out of Russia, there are hundreds of thousands of people who were punished in different ways for likes on social media, for their words, for showing on some events. Right now, repressions are targeting those people who are bringing flowers to different places, different monuments that are used as the Navalny monuments ad hoc. And those people who left their signatures to support Nadezhdin, all those names of his supporters were given to FSB, to special services. And people who have signed for that are now getting their conscription writs to be mobilized into defense forces and to be sent on the front where their destiny is awaiting for them. And again, those who, and that's probably running ahead of your questions, but those who are going to participate on the 17th of March in any public appearances at the voting polls, near voting polls, that midday after of the last day of elections, what Navalny was suggesting, to express their protest. The current technology allows to identify these people, to record them, to find out who came out at noon. And not surprisingly, these people will get their conscription notices to go and fight in this war. And to be, sorry for my slang, to be utilized at the fronts of Russian-Ukrainian war. Putin is solving a most important task of his political existence, of his now totalitarian regime. It's not authoritarian anymore. It has no signs of getting softer, only getting harder on its population. The whole western border of Russia is locked. On all borders, they are controlling everybody who's coming in, who's coming out, not only by documents, but where you were, whom you visited, whom you contacted, what is on your computer, what is on your cell phone. So proper totalitarian regime with almost zero probability to resist. The only resistance that is possible on the territory of Russia, inside Russia, outside of Russia, is resistance by force. No other realistic options to resist his regime exist. This is another serious problem, both for Russian opposition, public and political opposition, however you take it, and for Western partners and friends of Ukraine who in principle, don't afford, even in their thoughts, and are doing everything to resist the power resistance or a resistance by force to Putin's regime. Official position of the Western leadership now is to not let Putin's regime fall down, to not let it become weaker, and to not allow for any resistance by force to his regime in Russia. And again, that's another big topic. We can talk about that if you like me to. And another big thesis I need to mention, why this strengthening of Putin's regime is happening, and it is happening in the shadow of growth of Russian economy, strengthening of Russian armed forces, one of the main reasons. And we did talk about the regime becoming more totalitarian, more terroristic. There is a very strong economic base for that. And it is colossal financial resources that Western countries, not only Western, but mostly Western, are transferring to Putin's regime by way of purchasing resources, of course, oil and gas resources that Russia is offering for sale on the world market. Do you have at least an approximate number, perhaps, Andrei Nikolaevich, what Putin is getting from that? In 23, Lyudmila, he received $400 billion from Russian exports. It decreased compared to 22. In 22, that was absolutely record-breaking levels, almost $600 billion. Never in all history of Russia the profit was that big. And now it went down, first of all, because the prices for oil went down on the world markets, but $400 billion with a B. This is what Putin's regime got during 2023 from export of its resources, which, of course, to a large degree is being used for the war against Ukraine. And a little bit of it probably used against Russian opposition to continue repressing any disturbance in the country. So let's compare what's the aid that was provided to Ukraine by United States in 2023. That number is known, $12.1 billion. We're now talking about military aid, right? Yes. Now, Lyudmila, as for European countries, we don't have such exact number, but we can aggregate what is known from what they provided. We can say that the real military aid that was supplied to the territory of Ukraine from all other countries, not only Europe, but all other countries. It'll be Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, South Korea. The aggregated number will be roughly comparable with American, slightly less maybe. It's difficult to run the exact total, but according to the data that I was capable to analyze, we can say it might be actually a little less, a little over American aid, so slightly more than what America donated. So summarily, we can say that all the partners and friends of Ukraine gave $24 billion, plus economic aid. We have exact numbers on that. We have exact numbers of Ministry of Finance of Ukraine. They're reporting everything, $21 billion. What was provided by all the partners, all the allies on bilateral, multilateral, International Monetary Fund, European Bank, $21 billion. So you put two numbers together, you get $45 billion. And this is how the external world helped Ukraine. This was all the help in its totality. 24 approximately billions of military aid and 21 billion of economic aid. 45 billion. How did the world at large help Putin? $400 billion. Yes, these are not grants. They're not credits. But they're payments for the resources that Russia offered for sale on the global market. And these resources were paid in currencies. Convertible currencies, less convertible currencies, but still, these are resources, and these are the resources that need to be compared. So we can go to one of the most important questions about the future, about tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, and we can ask this question to ourselves. A small clarification before we go talk about the future. And the question to you as a known economist, the fact that Russia expanded its industrial production by adding military production, does it matter for economy? Are there any limits there? In other words, if Russia is wasting all its resources to produce tanks, shells, etc., that go to the front and get destroyed there, does it matter in a long-term or short-term perspective? I understand that perhaps in a long-term perspective it's a different story, but a long story, Long term is a different one. So in a short term, is there any effect that we can monitor or not if we talk about economy and structure? So look, if we're taking official numbers of the military expenses, of course they include the monies paid for salaries, but also money assigned to purchasing materials. Very often the number that is used for Russia is 6% of Russian GDP. If you calculate it more accurately, if you include other things that are not included in the official numbers that go by other channels, that would be about 8%. Even if you rerun it in different numbers and other prices, still, it doesn't reach beyond 10% of Russian GDP. Official number is 6. Then the question is, what was the weight of military expenses for Soviet Union during the Second World War? It was 40%. So just to understand what examples do we have and to which level, under other conditions, that number can grow. Great Britain, 40%, 50%, 60% during the Second World War. United States, 38%. Germany, at the end of that war, their numbers reached 67%. Understandable, that was a total war, but still. And the level of military expenses at 15%. Israel lived in the 50s and 60s of the 20th century, the first phase of their existence. For the first several decades, surrounded by enemies, essentially, the level of their military expense kept for several decades at 50, 60%. And as we see, Israel did not disappear anywhere and are actually still developing, right? Growing, have good industries. Why am I placing these numbers in your mind? So that you understand the levels of military expense and the level it can reach in case escalation continues. And if we do not stop the crimes of today and do not provide an adequate pushback, and instead we are actually confirming them and giving more money to the perpetrator. If we are talking about Ukraine, this year, in 24, they expect their military expenses to be $52 billion. This was the number published literally a couple of days ago on the European conference in Kiev by the representatives of the Budget Committee of Congress of Ukraine. And their GDP this year will likely be about $160, $150 billion. Military expenses are about 33% of their economy. If Ukraine is doing that, understandably, with allies and partners and friends, who says that Putin cannot do that? Especially if he is getting significant monetary support from outside. Again, this is not happening yet with friends and allies on the Putin side, but a couple years ago, we heard people in streams not only on the Ukrainian channels, but also in the West, all these generals, many star generals and so-called economic experts and representatives of the White House and other organizations were saying this is impossible, this cannot happen. Putin was looking at that and was doing. And now they're coming out surprised, oh, nobody could have imagined it. Right, exactly. Their last statements exactly sound like this. We did not expect Russian economy to be that strong. That basically outlines, Ludmila, the understanding of their own professional incompetence for those analysts. Because anyone who had access to the situation and its development in the last couple of years with processes that are unfolding during military conflicts, at least some basic acknowledgement, that means that people who were predicting early on in this war either don't know anything or they had a very lackadaisical approach to their predictions. So even in Ukraine, there is a significant part of population that likes listening to fairy tales, but not to reality. And not to go deeper and not to throw stones into your windows, Ludmila, but other channels and other audiences, they're very prone to supporting that peachy and rainbowy beautiful picture that doesn't exist. As we're addressing the question now, we can say that we cannot give any optimistic conclusion that Russian resources will run in a month, in 2 or in 2-3 weeks, as well heard. For now, all these vectors are still indicating an upward trend, and it only tells us about the increase of escalation that likely will be resulted not only in the military production but also in the escalations on the field. Andrei Nikolaevich, before the interview with you, I did skim a lot of titles, a lot of headlines of different publications in Europe. And some things actually, I think, are good. They're changing. On the backdrop of what's happening in America, Europe decided to get their stuff together. And especially in the last couple of weeks, we hear a lot of statements from Europe about aid that will be coming in the next few weeks, maybe months. And even at the conference in Paris, they discussed not only helping Ukraine, but Macron even brought up the matter of probably sending troops of the Western countries, of NATO countries, into Ukraine. But the parties present have not reached agreement, according to Macron. And understandably, that was expected, that they will not reach agreement. It's a big matter, a big question. But the fact that they're discussing it, this is very peculiar, very interesting. And then we also can see that in Europe, by the leaders of European countries, there are a lot of attempts to start looking for different military equipment, especially long-range reaching systems. Sikorsky from the Atlantic Council also appealed to America to provide more military systems to Ukraine, more arms to Ukraine. And these are just me sampling some of the publications. Looking at that, I am under impression that European leaders start to play a bigger role and understand their role in this war to be much bigger than they initially thought of. And even bringing the possibility of bringing European troops to Ukrainian war theater, people are saying it's just conversations, just talk, but, Patriot systems were also just talk back in the day. So, Andrei Nikolaevich, do you think we can rely on Europe? Do you think they're becoming a stronger partner? And what is happening in the United States? Ludmila, you have touched upon several very important topics here, and I have several points I want to make in regards to all of them. And you can guide me whether you want to go deeper or the top level is enough. So first, using armed forces on the territory of Ukraine and their participation in this war. Not volunteers, not individuals, not contractors, but actual troops of other countries. European countries, non-European countries, NATO countries, and others. Exactly that, if you remember, I mentioned, I was saying from the first day of this war that Ukraine will not be able to win this war alone. Not only in terms of getting additional material supplies, but also in regards to using different resources on the field. Ukraine will not be able to win it alone. So in this war, in my opinion, armed forces of other countries should be participating. So all the statements that were made during the last couple of years, and some of them are still being made by Ukraine officials, especially the ones that are saying we'll do it on our own, we can carry on, we'll succeed. This is a signature for me of incompetence. I think these people are incompetent and they're lacking responsibility. They're not taking full responsibility for their own country and their own citizens. We should be using all opportunities to add additional resources. Perhaps we can negotiate how to and in what format, but to neglect and to push back on the suggestions about bringing other armies of other countries to the front, to Ukraine, this is just unacceptable. I was making statements about that early on when I was alone. Now I can say that on the Munich conference on the 19th of February of 2022, 5 days before the Russian invasion into Ukraine, on all sessions where I was present with all Ukrainian and Western colleagues and participants, I was bringing up this topic. I was saying that the most important thing for us to preclude Russian invasion, and we remember those days before that happened, remember what was happening on air and what was happening off air. I was saying that in order to stop a threat of Putin's invasion into Ukraine, you need to immediately place regular troops of United States in Ukraine. I even gave certain locations where they have to be placed. These brigades needed to be there. This is not a guarantee, but this would increase the chance of this war not happening. That large-scale invasion would not have happened. Not a single one, not only from the Western opponents, colleagues that I was talking to, but also Ukrainian colleagues and people present on this summit, none of them supported this suggestion. And I was bringing at that moment organization called JEF. We, I think, touched about that in a previous stream with you. It's called Joint Expeditionary Force. This is the organization that includes 10 countries. 8 of them are members of NATO. 2 are not members of NATO, but this organization informally is led by United Kingdom as an organization of North European countries that was created a while ago, and by its status, it doesn't have NATO as its umbrella, so it can act independently of NATO. So that means they don't need any coordination with NATO authorities. Exactly so. This organization includes countries that are members of NATO and countries that are not members of NATO. One of those non-members already became, so Finland is now a member of NATO. Switzerland will become in the near future. So overall, that structure doesn't need a yay from NATO. So making decision in the framework of this organization, including sending regular troops to the front, can be done without any NATO participation. So once again, I'll say that these matters were discussed back then. Nobody took them seriously at the moment, and we know the results. But sooner or later, we will have to return to that. And we need to make certain conclusions, both Ukrainian civil society and Ukrainian leadership. And of course, by no means, I think it's almost criminal to resist these operations, these possibilities. Because once again, in my view, without this participation, Ukraine will not be able to achieve a breakthrough in this war, not even talking about victory. Second part of this question, why Europe is so concerned. Why have they started to discuss these questions? Why are they discussing matters of military expenses, military production, forming the single defense strategy, forming single intel strategy? That indeed happened in the last few weeks. Do you know why? We know the answer. The author of that push in European politics in regards to Ukraine and in regards to its own military production, defense of Europe, is one person. He is not a president. He is a private person, at least for now. We know his last name and his name, Donald Trump, who dropped one phrase at the election campaign in South Carolina. And he didn't say what he did, what he was doing, or what he will absolutely do. He said about his private conversation, which people did not know happened 2 years ago. He mentioned it first time before South Carolina, but it was left under the radar. People did not pay much attention to it because they thought he will not be back in the office. But now it is being reviewed rather seriously. So he talked about his private conversation with the leader of one big European country. Looking at the signs of this conversation, it appears to be Germany. And in the conversation with the leader of that big country, Trump said that he will not be protecting that country if it is not fulfilling its obligations within the NATO framework. And the leader of that country surprisingly, reportedly, asked, so if we're not paying the necessary dues into NATO, you will not be defending us in case of war? He said, yes, indeed, I will not be defending you. And these words he repeated not a single time already. He mentioned them on a few occasions, but right now, in the situation that is unfolding in the United States, that phrase was amplified, distorted, and became viral by multi-billion posts and publications. Everybody heard that, and suddenly Europeans started to dawn on them that this variant may actually happen in real life. And it doesn't mean that Trump will actually do that, that he will not be or would not be doing it if that happens, if it comes to that. There were no military actions at that point. But they made their conclusions. And that sudden understanding of this possibility, of this eventuality, drew Europe to conclude that they need to rely upon themselves in order to be able to defend themselves. Because during the last decades, they got used to the nuclear umbrella of the United States, and both nuclear and non-nuclear, essentially German armed forces were destroyed, decimated by the leader of Germany, Frau Merkel, who during her lengthy stay in power basically destroyed Bundeswehr. Putin could not even have dreamt about it. Qualitatively, quantitatively, in the questions of training, she even managed to liquidate the pride, the earned pride of Germany, of the General Command of Germany. They were the first country that ever created Central Command, that idea that was called later by many the brain of an army, and that was copied by countless nations after from Germany. For the first time was created in Prussia during military reforms at the beginning of the 19th century, after experiences shared and lessons learned from it by von Clausewitz and his colleagues after the defeat in Auschwitz and Jena. And that pride, that brain, you remember French president mentioned recently that the brain of NATO is corrupted. So Frau Merkel extracted the brain from her own army. So after all that, how do you think the Putin feels himself? Of course, elated. So in the years preceding this stage of war, especially during President Obama, there was a horrible, catastrophic dwindling of military expenses and military production, the numbers of military armed forces, degradation and destruction of the whole military infrastructure of European continent. A while ago, we discussed with you and with other colleagues, and many people were saying that Baltic countries by themselves will not be able to defend their own in case an aggressor from the east comes after them. But if you look at the real situation of armed forces in Europe, Europe is not capable to defend itself either, because these military institutes were dismantled. To be continued in part 2.